FIFA has allowed individual federations to interpret the law autonomously as well. As long as they are all on the same page on certain matters, federations are allowed to amend certain laws to better suit football, its culture, and law in their own part of the world. Moving closer to home, Mr. James Kitching, who is founder and managing director of Kitching Sports, will update us on the most important developments in Asian football law.
Thank you for the introduction. While we're setting up, again, I would like to echo my fellow participants in thanking Nandan & Co. for the invitation and the excellent hospitality that we have here. As you may or may not have already heard, and anyone that's heard me give a presentation or a talk before, I apologise, because I say exactly the same thing, but my accent's very obviously Australian. So if you don't understand me at any point, I won't get offended. If you have any questions, please let me know. And if you want to talk about Steve Smith, I'm very much open to doing so. When Nandan & Co. asked me to talk about Asian football law, I think if he recalls, the first thing I said on the phone was, well, there is no such thing as Asian football law, which is what I think we had a quick discussion with two friends here this morning. So what I propose to do over the next half an hour is rather than talk about sort of a broader concept of Asian football law, first I'll delve a little bit into the governance, which John and Mark both have touched on. Then what I'll do is I'll look at some certain specific issues that have occurred in various Asian countries, which might be interesting to you, which touch upon international and national sporting rules. And in that, there is a disclaimer. I'm not going to talk about Australia and the recent governance problems there, and nor am I going to talk about India, because I'm sure we can all talk about that outside the room later. So I'll skip this one. So this is what I'm going to talk about very quickly. China, UAE, Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. But very quickly at the start, I'll talk about governance and basically reflect what John and Mark were just talking about this morning. So football governance 101. Football itself, global phenomenon. We all know that. From an interest perspective, from a media perspective, it is one of, if not the highest industry within an industry of sport in terms of attention, in terms of people talking about it, in terms of these days in the metrics, clicks, likes, retweets, etc., etc. But the governing bodies inside football themselves, they are somewhat unique in their structure. So when we look at other non-profit sector types, or we look at government institutions, for example, or we look at large corporations that span across many countries, football governing bodies, sports governing bodies are somewhat unique in this sense, in that generally they are not corporations, generally they are not set up like traditional NGOs, or generally they're not from government. They're set up in a specific way to take advantage of laws in the jurisdictions where they exist. And one of the things about football, or sport, but predominantly football, is that bottom line that I have up there about governance. And the governance of the sport itself is scrutinised much more than that of any other private organisation. When I'm at universities and I do this lecture, I always ask people, well, who is and someone who's heard this lecture before is nodding at the back, so I apologise. I always ask people, who's the president of FIFA, who's the president of your local football association? They know. And then my next question is, well, let's talk about something important. Who's the president of your local Red Cross or Red Crescent? Who's the president of another NGO which makes a fundamental difference to those in society? And people don't know, even though those industries might be much bigger from a scope of people that they influence and impact, and the amount of money that comes through those industries. So they're the types of things that we throw into football governance right from the get-go. Now, what is good governance? These are the types of things you normally see when we talk about good governance, these types of words, these types of phrases. And I would put it to the room here, and people may disagree with me, but at least on paper, from a paper perspective, football has what I would consider to be one of the best governance models in world sport. But where that model trips up, of course, is the people inside the system itself that take advantage of specific positions or simply don't follow the rules. So taking a step back, sports governing bodies essentially have, well, I'd say three main functions. One is they organise competitions. They make money. they develop their stakeholders, whether that's at a national level, that might be their clubs, that might be their players, it might be their leagues. At a regional level, it might be their associations and their members, or at an international level, similarly. And they reinvest that money they make from competitions through sponsorship, through ticket sales, through television rights, etc. Into technical and infrastructure and other types of activities that require funding to be reinvested. And then finally, the third thing that sports governing bodies do is they regulate. So what they do is they implement the rules, regulations, the laws of the game, etc., which govern both their sport on the field and off the field. Now, in terms of football, this is a graphic I use often, there are various different areas of regulatory authority, is what I call them, which are shared amongst FIFA as the international federation, confederations as the regional bodies, which have their own, as John said very rightly this afternoon, are recognised by FIFA but not members of FIFA. They have their own areas of autonomy, and then certain areas which they both act within. As you can see in the middle, they both run, FIFA and confederations both run competitions, they both develop, they both run elections, etc., etc. Now, at national level, you see there's no circle up there for a national association, member association, football association, whatever you want to call it. National associations do all of this in their domestic territory. So they cover all of these areas of regulatory authority. They either take guidance from FIFA or guidance from their confederation, or from both, depending on what the subject matter is, and they implement their rules and their policies within that guidance, within their own defined territory, of either country or territory, depending where they're domiciled. So world football, very quickly. Thank you, Wikipedia, for some excellent open source images. This is how world football is generally organised, with 6 confederations. FIFA's in the middle. AFC, where we are, as you can see, is in the pink. In terms of, on the screen anyway, it's certainly the biggest. In terms of some very quick statistics, we did cover data this morning. 2/3 of the world's population, 11 different time zones, over 30 different official languages, several countries which are actually sanctioned by the UN. So the transfer of money is quite difficult, particularly when you're trying to pay television rights money, which comes out in US dollars. Birthplace of every major religion, birthplace of many significant cultures. And a question I always like to ask is, how many democracies do you think are involved in these 46 or 47 member associations? And every year my answer changes because something happens in one country which is maybe, they go one way or the other, but it's less than 10. So the AFC sits in Kuala Lumpur, basically in the middle of that pink graph, and attempts to govern football across Asia, taking into account all of those different factors. 11 women eventually play against 11 women in a football match, 5 men against 5 men in a futsal match. And we're told that politics has to stay out of sport, and that simply we just have to look at sporting rules and regulations and forget about all of those cultural factors which ultimately make up what is the Asian Football Confederation. Asian Football Confederation is again broken down into 5 different and specific, what we'd call regional confederations or regional federations, and they're highlighted there for you on the screen. Obviously, India, the All Indian Football Federation, is a member of the South Asian Football Federation, and those countries are highlighted in blue. Now, John mentioned a pyramid before. I've got the pyramid, so I'll whack it up on the screen. So FIFA at the top of the pyramid as the International Federation talks down basically to those underneath FIFA in the pyramid. Confederations you'll see on the left, they're not members of FIFA, but they're recognised by FIFA. All of the confederations except UEFA have language inside their constitutions which say we agree to abide by the decisions, rules, policies, regulations, etc. of FIFA. UEFA just simply says we agree that we are a confederation recognised by FIFA, so their lawyers have done quite well. On the other side, you can see the Football Association. They have, like we said before, a dual membership. Football Association, so AIFF, are a member of both FIFA and a member of their confederation, which is the AFC. Now, underneath that, each football association does have the autonomy within its own region, subject to some very firm guidance by FIFA, to set its own membership of its own association within its own constitutional documents. And those members may be, as you can see up on the screen, involving their clubs, regional associations, if the country is organised in a way where there are states or regions, players, so player associations, or special interest groups. There might be a referee association, a futsal association, a coaches association. That country might have a separate women's football association, etc. They can form part of the membership of a football association, and each country is different in how it's structured based on the history and evolution of football in that country. Now, generally, the principles that come through from FIFA in terms of governance, they like to see a traditional separation of powers, which we would understand from a sort of Western democratic model, where you have a Congress, a parliament, essentially, which is made up of representatives of the members, all the members. So in this case, it would be the football associations. And they elect an executive committee, and that executive committee makes the executive decisions on behalf of the association. And either the Congress or the executive committee, subject to the rules of that association, would appoint a judicial body, so for example an ethics committee or an appeal committee, or they would elect a judicial body. And traditionally, I think the formatting might be slightly off here, I apologise. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's a different resolution, I'm sorry. But traditionally, this is how the inside of a football association would look, traditionally and generally, based on a decision-making framework. So you'd have a Congress at the top, which is made up of the members. They make the core decisions. They may have to make strategic decisions subject to the subject matter. And then a board or executive committee, or however it's called in that particular part of the world, who are elected by the Congress to take those day-to-day strategic decisions. And then they're supported by standing committees. You might know them, such as the Competitions Committee, the Player Status Committee, Marketing Committee, whatever it might be. Subsequently, that board, that executive committee, will appoint their CEO. That will be the General Secretary, and he will run, or she will run, the administration of the organisation, which will be the staff, or the General Secretariat, however it's called, at the bottom, and they will manage the day-to-day operations of the strategies that are implemented by or adopted by the board, the executive committee, and the Congress. Now, independently and separately to that, and this again is a sort of a best case scenario, and as you can imagine, not every country looks like this, there would be an independent external internal auditing body, which reports directly to the Congress, and they would manage compliance on behalf of the organisation. Generally, they'd either be elected or appointed, subject to how that country works. Judicial bodies, like I said, and then in an ideal world, there'll be external oversight by a third party. Sport has chosen arbitration, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why sports arbitration has been adopted by sport as a mechanism to resolve disputes. But generally, the Court of Arbitration for Sport or a similar national level arbitration body may be the external oversight, where if people are unhappy with decisions internally or want to challenge anything legally internally, they can take their case to that body. So that's governance in 10 minutes or less, not bad. This says 12, but I don't think it was that long. So recent Asian football law issues. So very quickly, we'll run over a couple. So China, naturalisation, sporting nationality. So naturalisation is not a new topic in football. I'm aware in India there's been much discussion about naturalisation in the past, not so much recently, given the structure of national citizenship law in India and the inability of an individual to be a dual citizen. So I'm sure football fans can recognise the two fellas on the screen. One is on the left-hand side, a World Cup winner from Italy. One on the right-hand side is a European champion from Spain. Neither of those players were born in those countries. Mauro, I'm Italian, so this is really bad, I just botched that. Mauro Camoranesi was born in Argentina and qualified for Italian citizenship through a great-grandparent. And Marcos Senna, on the right, lived in Spain for the requisite amount of time, had no previous blood link to Spain, lived in Spain for the requisite amount of time to qualify for citizenship through Spanish national law, and subsequently represented Spain at the 2006 World Cup and 2008 European Championships. And of course, this fella, who's played for two different national teams, is one that raised this issue before the 2014 World Cup. Diego Costa, of course, being born, bred and raised Brazilian, but ended up playing in official football matches for Spain. Now, when we talk about sporting nationality is something which I do view as something which we can talk about within the sort of ambit of sports law or football law. In football, sporting nationality is governed by Articles 5 to 8 of the FIFA statutes. Now, Article 5 is on your screen. That's the general regulation which governs whether someone can play for a representative team or not. I've underlined Article 5, very simple. You need to be holding permanent nationality that is not dependent on residence to be eligible. So basically, for the most part, what FIFA does to prove that you hold such permanent nationality is you pull out your passport. So, okay, I've got an Australian passport, hence I'm eligible to play for Australia prima facie, subject to a number of other restrictions. You can see number 2 talks about some exceptions and some other articles. What I'm going to talk about today, because we're going to be talking in the context of China, is acquisition of nationality. So Article 7 of the FIFA regulations governing the application of the statutes talks about when someone who's acquired a new nationality becomes eligible to play for their new country that they've acquired that nationality for. Now, there's four certain criteria which they need to meet at least one of to be eligible to play for their new country, and you can see them on the screen. They are either born on the territory of that association, their parents were born there, their grandparents were born there, or after the age of 18, they've lived there for 5 years. So if you're wondering how Diego Costa might qualify to play for Spain or Marcos Senna, they both qualified through Article 7D, which is the 5-year rule after you turn 18. Now, there is an exception which I'll get into very quickly. I don't have the law on the screen, but if you've played international A football for another country, or another football association, I should say, because not all football associations represent countries, then you are not permitted to play international football for another football association at any level. Now, let's take this discussion to China. So right before we take this discussion to China, one step back, you can see then ultimately the eligibility to play for a national team in international football, if you're looking to acquire a new nationality, will very likely and does depend on the nationality law of the country that governs the football association who you want to represent. So in countries where you can go and take a second passport or second nationality, or you can acquire dual citizenship within 1 or 2 years, they may be more valuable for you as opposed to a country or a territory such as, one off the top of my head is Hong Kong, where it takes 8 years to get the permanent residency, which FIFA will then recognise for someone to participate in international football for Hong Kong. Chinese nationality law is as such, no dual nationality. Nationality, like many countries, is generally obtained by descent through parents, grandparents, etc., and can be acquired in certain circumstances. So are near relatives, which is essentially through your parents, have settled in China or have other legitimate reasons. So we won't get into that too much. Now, the foreign player rules in the Chinese Super League are very similar to most of Asia. Clubs are permitted to sign 4 foreign players in their registered squads and can field 3 at any one time on the pitch. Now, at the start of this year, for those that follow Asian football and Chinese football, you would have noticed that Chinese clubs were starting to sign players of Chinese ancestry. So you started to have clubs researching into the ancestry and history of players who, on their face, would not appear to have any Chinese blood, whether their ancestry came through a great-grandparent, a grandparent, or vice versa. Now, as you can see on the screen, why are those players desirable? Well, if that player is better than a Chinese footballer that you have at your club already in the same position, if he's able to acquire Chinese nationality, then accordingly he becomes very valuable to you, because you can effectively have a foreigner come in who is Chinese, who may not have ever lived in China, considered himself Chinese, have any ethnic link to China. Similarly, on the other side, those players who are in that position have realised their own value within the market and have been commanding large salaries from clubs that have been undertaking this practice. Now, the CFA was surprised by this. So the Chinese Football Association, I always used to say, and I always still do say, when a football organising body makes a rule, everybody who is subject to that rule, do their absolute best to push that rule as hard as they can to get through the cracks and find all the loopholes. Well, the Chinese Football Association was surprised by this. It wasn't expecting this to happen, so it suspended the Super League, or these players being able to play in the Super League, until a policy could be developed. Ultimately, they developed a policy about a month later, which said that, okay, we'll let these players play as Chinese, but they have to do all of these things in order to ensure their ongoing eligibility. The last one, I think the most concerning from the perspective of the player advocates, certainly. And just some examples of some of the players that have come through. The first player that came through, and a couple of clubs are very prominent in this section. We had a Norwegian footballer, John who became the first naturalised footballer in February. Nico Yanaris, who did many media interviews, so maybe you saw them in the British media or not. He also was playing for Beijing Guan, naturalised through his mother being Chinese, and became the first naturalised Chinese footballer to play for the Chinese Football Association representative teams. So after being surprised about it in March and not knowing what to do, the Chinese Football Association said, hold on, we can also benefit from this as well. And this player, for those that follow Asian football, you'd know Elkerson, who was the top scorer for Guangzhou Evergrande in the Chinese League for several years, and also was a top scorer 1 year in the Asian Champions League. He's now been in China for more than 5 years in accordance with the FIFA regulations and in accordance with Chinese nationality law. He also is eligible for Chinese citizenship and is in the process of acquiring that citizenship. So that gives you some threshold questions, though, which is what we always talk about when we regulate in sport. Is this fair? Is this fair that this can happen in China? Is this fair to other Chinese clubs? Can the bigger clubs take advantage of their scouting networks? You saw 2 Beijing Guan players on the screen, a Guangzhou Evergrande player. Some other players that have come through the naturalization process have also come from the big clubs. One player from one of the big Shanghai clubs, Guangzhou Evergrande, had another player as well. In international football, again, it's that age-old question when countries go through a naturalization process. Quick fix, let's get better players who are from some other nationality, get them to come play for us. Or let's actually recognise the reason why we need to bring those players in is because our national development system isn't working, and we need to work on our national development system. So some of those questions you may wish to ponder. United Arab Emirates, very quickly, we talked about the FIFA RSTP this morning. One of the things about the FIFA RSTP which are very interesting is that they mandate 2 things. One, each national association needs to develop their own transfer rules. That's what's underlined there for you in red. And I haven't put Article 1.3 on there, but Article 1.3 says these are the things in the FIFA rules which you must have in your national rules. These are the things in the FIFA rules which we recommend you have in your national rules, and there's other things in the FIFA rules which they're silent about. Now, for those that read the website Law and Sport, you would have seen an excellent article on this very recently. The United Arab Emirates has its own regulations on the status and transfer of players, and Article 13 governs the scenario whereby a youth player, after receiving the age of majority, after turning 18, decides to sign his professional contract. And you can see there, the RSTP provides what, in very plain language in Arabic translated into English, obliges a player. He's got no choice under these rules. Obliges a player to sign a professional contract with that club where he's trained, unless, it's cut off by the screen resolution there, unless he receives no written contract offer within 2 months of turning 18. So under these rules as they currently stand, if a player turns 18 years old, he is obliged to sign a contract with the club that trained him if he receives a written contract offer within the time period of 18 years old and 1 day up until 18 years, 1 month, and whatever it might be, 30 or 31, depending on the cut of your jib, basically. Now, the UAE Football Association justifies this stance and cites the oft-quoted specificity of sport, talking about lower division clubs being concerned that their good talents are going to get ransacked when they turn 18 and sign for free for a high-level club, meaning that all those efforts they put into training that player wouldn't allow them to be adequately compensated, and it creates a balance between the investment and investment of lower level clubs and high level clubs. But again, the resolution again, I apologize. Again, the FIFA RSTP themselves were born, as we discussed very quickly, were born out of the agreement following Bosman in 2000, or 1995 was Bosman, in 2001 the RSTP came along. And at their heart, there's two real principles. One is contractual stability. So a contract can only be terminated with just cause. So in that sense, the regulations exist for the purpose of ensuring that contracts are respected. And the second one is that very famous principle, one of those principles that came from Bosman, is freedom of contract, freedom of movement. And both my fellow speakers in this session spoke about it earlier today. When a contract has expired, you, like in any other walk of employment, you are free to sign a contract as you wish. Now, the regulations, in some respects, may put payments in place for future training compensation from the new club to an old club, etc., but they don't provide any inhibition of a player signing a contract with a new club. In this case, in the UAFA, there's been several cases that have gone before their own dispute panels, whereby contracts have been invalidated because these rules weren't complied with. So when this first really came to light about 8 years ago, FIFA wrote to the UEFA and said, no, unless your national law contains a similar provision to this for all employees, this needs to be removed. It violates contractual freedom. Unfortunately, at that point, FIFA's instruction, if you recall before I talked about mandatory provisions, recommendations, etc., it was only considered a recommendation because this type of clause, according to FIFA at that time and the Federation, is not one which falls within those mandatory provisions. It's only really a recommendation. And so in that sense, Article 13 doesn't fall within that scope of Article 1.3 of the FIFA RSTP, which says this is a mandatory clause which you need to include in your contract, in your regulations. Now, let's talk way of contrast. Last year, the UAE FA and the UAE government decided to issue a resolution which allowed non-UAE citizens born on the territory of the United Arab Emirates, subject to certain conditions, to compete in national competitions as locals. So a child of an expat born in the UAE, lived there for 15 years, under UAE nationality law, never entitled to UAE citizenship. However, they've lived in the UAE all their life. This new circular basically says they can compete as nationals, not count towards foreign player quotas. And interestingly, in this scope, Article 13 of the UAE RSTP does not apply to these kids. So these kids hit 18 years old, and the UEFA won't enforce Article 13 against these kids if they decide to sign their first professional contract for a different club that trained them. So again, is this fair? Is this something which FIFA needs to look into in Article 1.3 of the RSTP and amend its mandatory regulations? Would this situation ever exist if the UEFA recognised a registered players association in the country that was advocating on behalf of the players? Maybe we'll find out in the future. National dispute resolution chambers, very quickly. Recent years, Malaysia and Indonesian football are certainly clubs in Malaysia and Indonesia, and I give you some examples on the screen, have been what we colloquially call FIFA's best customers because they basically don't pay players and coaches, but to the largest extent players. And situations like Mark described are certainly not uncommon in these two territories. And some recent decisions you'll see here: in February, Perlis FA was kicked out of the Malaysian second division for not paying its players at all or its coaches. It actually has outstanding dues back to 2017. And just last month, a few days ago, in June, Penang FA was docked points by FIFA. You're covering up minutes left. That's all right. Oh, damn it, I can see it now. In June, Penang FA, which had just qualified for promotion to the Malaysian top division, had 6 points docked at the end of the season because it had failed to comply with the FIFA decision to pay a player. And very famously, a few years back, Pahang FA was docked points by FIFA after its season finished. And as a result of that docking of points, the AFC had to quickly scramble to amend its AFC Cup draw because that docking of points meant that they hadn't qualified for European competition. Now, we talked very briefly about disputes of international dimension. If we look at Article 22 of the FIFA RSTP, so Article 22 of the FIFA RSTP says that disputes of between players and clubs of international dimension are to be heard by FIFA unless what? Unless the parties explicitly decide to have their dispute heard at a national dispute arbitration tribunal, which meets certain criteria, which you'll see at the bottom. So in FIFA language, they must guarantee fair proceedings and respect the principle of equal representation of players and clubs. FIFA defined that in a circular as far back as 2005. Those principles are principles which everybody here that might have been involved in an employment tribunal or been involved in any form of dispute resolution would certainly recognise and understand. Parity, so parties have equal say over the appointment of arbitrators and arbitrators on an arbitration list. Independent tribunal, right to a fair hearing, right to examine and basically dispute the evidence put forward by the other party, and principle of equal treatment. 2 years after introducing to football stakeholders how FIFA defined this phrase in the middle here, independent arbitration tribunal, 2 years later, FIFA introduced what we call National Dispute Resolution Chamber regulations, and basically notified football associations, if you would like to adopt an independent arbitration tribunal, we highly recommend that you adopt one in the form of what we call an NDRC and adopt regulations which are compliant with our standard regulations which we have provided to you. Now in 2017, a very good friend of mine who used to head the FIFA Professional Football Department started a pilot program to implement NDRCs in several countries around the world, such as Malaysia and Indonesia, where clubs had poor track records in player and coach payments. And the way they did that was quite novel and unique in terms of FIFA and the way that FIFA acts. So FIFA traditionally has only ever communicated with its indirect members, as John was talking about this morning, through its football association. So if it wants to talk to a player, it wants to talk to a club, it will go first to a football association and then ask the football association to pass on its message. Now FIFA, in the last sort of half decade, and certainly through this program, has embraced what we'd call stakeholder involvement in their operations. And certainly in this project, the way it was set up was FIFA sat down in a room over in this case over 2 years, sat down in a room with the core stakeholders that are involved in employment-related disputes in football. Sat down with the football association, sat down with the player association in that particular country, and also sat down with either the club association if one existed, if there was no club association, with representative from the league association. And those stakeholders all came together, probably the first time a lot of them had been in the room together and also were smiling at each other across a table in a room. And they nutted out together standard regulations in that country, standard football employment contract, which the player associations and FIFPro were happy with, and which on the other side the clubs were happy with, and also the members and composition of their national dispute resolution chambers. And last week, I changed it to last month, because now we're in August, Football Association of Malaysia and Football Association of Indonesia both announced the formation of their national dispute resolution chambers to act as that independent arbitration tribunal in their territory in accordance with FIFA RSTP. And I put up here just one photo from the announcement of the Malaysian tribunal and of course one of the core stakeholders who I think the most important stakeholder who was involved in those negotiations. Some questions for you. Should international related disputes be arbitrated at national level? FIFA has of course set up its own international tribunals through the Dispute Resolution Chamber and the Player Status Committee to handle international disputes. And if they were implemented in each country, would we see similar decisions? Would we see the same protections, application of legal principles, etc.? Now, he's not holding up the next page, so I'm guessing I'm gone well over that 5 minutes. So I'll skip over the last one, but very quickly, cross-border competition. So what this means is clubs that are from one country playing in the league of another country. Very quickly here, you have some examples which currently exist in Asian football. Wellington in Australia, RNF, who are from Guangzhou playing in the Hong Kong Premier League, and two clubs in the Singapore S League, one a sister club from Japan and the other one effectively the only football club from Brunei. So why Saudi Arabia and Bahrain? Well, in the middle of last year, Saudi Arabian Football Federation, the Bahrain FA, decided to sit down and talk about how they could improve Bahraini football, and they came up with the idea, let's move a Bahraini club into the Saudi League. Saudi League's stronger, Saudi League has more money, Saudi League will give bigger exposure to our Bahraini players. They volunteered Al Maharak, who was the who is the oldest and most successful club in Bahraini football history. And in March this year, this was approved by the FIFA Council. Okay, so how is this actually regulated and how is this governed by FIFA? Article 73 of the FIFA statutes governs this scenario. And you'll see under the red line, basically the answer is there needs to be exceptional circumstances. Aside from everybody actually agreeing that this needs to happen, there needs to be exceptional circumstances to allow a club from one territory of a different association to play on the territory of another association. Now, just to make things fun for everybody in this room, and myself included, FIFA hasn't actually established operational regulations, unlike for many of its statutory clauses, to underpin or expand upon Article 73, which means that what we have is a regulatory vacuum. What are exceptional circumstances? So clubs and associations basically have no guidance as to what do they need to do to make an application? Do they need to fill out a form? Do they need to provide evidence of something? What are the procedural steps? The regulation says we need authorization by federation, confederation, FIFA. Where do they go first? Is it a competitions committee? Is it an associations committee? Is it a stakeholders committee? And finally, what are exceptional circumstances? Again, that's the million-dollar question. Now, these are the types of exceptional circumstances that I have seen used by individuals and by clubs and by federations to justify movement of clubs from one territory to another. A lot of those you may look at and think, well, they're not that exceptional. They're not circumstances which we would consider really, truly to be exceptional. And I tend to agree. I'd say number 1 and number 3 probably are the only two legitimate reasons now for exceptional circumstances to exist. Number 6 up there, maybe also an exceptional circumstance. Right now, we're going to have a deja vu situation in North America. So at the end of last year, for those that don't know, or this year, the Canadian Soccer Association launched the Canadian Premier League, the first top-tier competition in Canada after the former league was wound up. And we had a situation where Ottawa Fury, obviously a Canadian football club, had applied to play in the USL on the far right, which is the United Soccer League, which is in the second tier of American football. Now, in this scenario, of course, Article 73 of the FIFA statutes applies. What occurred in this case very quickly was that before the approvals of the two federations were even received to allow Ottawa to take the next step and ask their confederation for approval, CONCACAF decided to tell Ottawa, no, you can't play in the USL. If you come to us, we're not going to permit this. You need to play in the new Canadian Premier League, which is just starting. In 10 seconds or less, there was a lot of litigation threats, as you can imagine, given the area of the world that we're in and the amount of money that might have been involved. And ultimately, Ottawa relented. FIFA decided to take no decision because the proper process hadn't been followed. And Ottawa have a 1-year license to participate in the USL, in the United States League, despite being a Canadian team. Now, of course, that's coming to an end very soon, and we're going to have the same situation arising again in the near future. So, very quickly, 4 different areas of football law, if you can call it law, that have arisen in Asia over the last little while. I don't really have anything to say in conclusion because I'm sure that people will have questions, and I'm very glad we have a panel that I can sit down on and pass questions to others, so it's all good. If you want to get in touch, yes, I am under 40, so we're all over social media, so you can feel free to follow us and our team on social media. But if you have any questions or any comments, etc., I'm more than happy to discuss them with you and to speak frankly and candidly. Thank you.